Hey there, this is Phil. Welcome back to the Holy Post Podcast. I'm here with Skye Gibboney.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, Skye. And Christian Taylor.
Hey there, guys.
Hi, and Jason Ruggs listening in, running the controls on the side. Hi, Jason.
Hey there.
Hi. We have to get into this. I'm up against the time limit, so we have to go fast. So I'm going to go right into the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. Skye and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. So what have we not done? And it's been a serious time, and we've been doing serious stories. What have we not done in quite a while? Any idea?
Oh, no.
I know what it is,
comes.
but I'm not even going to say it out loud because I'm hoping you'll forget.
I'm afraid. I've been trying to do less of this, but it is time for News of the Butt.
And now it's time for News of the Butt.
A South African couple has turned elephant dung into award-winning gin. Yes, I think you heard me.
Gin.
Skye.
Gin, the alcohol.
Yeah, the alcohol. A South African couple is now bottling gin infused with elephant dung. If there's no easy way to say it, there's an easier way to drink it. Liquor stores and restaurants across South Africa and now Europe are selling out of Indlovu gin. Indlovu is Zulu for elephant. Skeptics may poo-poo what comes across as a novelty item, but tasters far and wide are praising a uniquely smoky, woody, earthy flavor that comes from the unlikeliest of ingredients.
Okay. All right.
So here's what they realized, okay, because this is kind of fun. This is a fun. Christian, wouldn't you agree that this is a fun story that was really worth?
Not yet. Just grossing me out and making my stomach hurt.
I'm just really glad that I really don't like gin.
Only about half of what elephants eat is absorbed, and the rest comes out their backsides. They eat fruits, nuts, flowers, leaves, and bark. And it's an interesting cross-section of Africa flora, which some people thought, well, would that make an interesting, basically like a tea to infuse into things? So here's what they did.
Couldn't you just go pick those things yourself? Why does it have to pass through an elephant?
No, because the elephant is the artist. The elephant is the chef. The elephant is saying, oh, today I'm going to mix 5 parts berries with 6 parts bark, and it's going to be, mwah! The elephant is saying, oh, the gin that's going to come out of me is going to be fantastic. It's a husband and wife team. After much experimenting, they learned that if they dried, washed, sterilized, macerated, and then re-dried elephant dung, they were left with a herbaceous smattering of African aromatics that could be safely infused into a base gin. Think of it like a tea bag. And people are actually, they're starting to win awards with their dung infused.
This reminds me of, I was eating oysters the other night and people were trying to get me to eat one. And I looked at that and thought, who in the heck at one point in time thought, let's eat this. This is going to be great.
Was it Mark Twain who said he was a brave man who first ate an oyster?
No, I don't know. I never heard of that.
Either brave or really desperate.
He was a brave man who first ate an oyster. So you can buy
the thing about this, who thinks that, okay, hey, let's make gin out of this poop?
Well, we know that we can sterilize things, and
I think this is just a ploy. I think they sat around and thought, what would be so outrageous it'll get attention for our gin, and it's a marketing device, right? So yeah, they're probably taking a little bit of elephant dung and distilling it all the way down to some whatever. There's barely anything left of it. And then they can say it's in there, and then it gets all this free publicity.
No, it's the flavor. It's the sourcing of the flavor. The bottle has an elephant on the label, and the catchphrase is elephant-infused botanicals.
Yeah, and I'm sure they give some of it to keep elephants alive and started. Yeah, I'm sure. And so again,
for a good cause, Christian.
More gin. It's a great marketing.
More gin. And this has been News of the Butt.
This has been the News of the Butt.
So we've talked a lot, been talking a lot about racism.
Really?
We in the last few weeks, yeah. We haven't, do you know what we haven't talked about very much? Patriarchy. It's the other bugaboo of Western civilization.
Other white meat.
Kristen Kobes Dumez, which I'm probably slaughtering her name, is a historian at Calvin University. When did they become a university? When was it? I thought
it was Calvin College.
Calvin College. This is Calvin University. She wrote a book called Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. Oh, it seems like everyone's mad at white evangelicals lately.
Well, can you blame them?
It seem that way?
There does seem to be a large book market for criticism of white evangelicals.
Yes. Okay.
Don't we have a podcast all about that?
For the past 80 years, Dumez argues, white evangelical speakers, writers, and media figures have been idealizing a form of manliness that is at once all Jesus and all John Wayne, calling their audiences to hyper-masculinity as an orienting center. Men are pushed to be extra manly, wives to be sexy and supportive, and children to mind authority as they grow into their own designated gender tracks. Along the way, this model of Christian patriarchy seeks to govern the home, the school, the church, and ultimately the nation. So this was an interview done by Eric Miller with Dumez for Religion and Politics. The journal, website, I'm not sure what it is. For over half a century, evangelicals have been focusing on the family, and distinct gender roles have been at the heart of this. Evangelicals have bought and read millions of books about how to raise boys and girls, how to be a man, and how to be a woman. To understand American evangelicalism, we have to take gender seriously. To understand how gender connects to theology and politics, and how it is at the heart of the evangelical worldview. Okay, would you agree with that? Skye, do you think manliness is maybe
next to godliness?
Did you ever read the book Wild at Heart by John Eldridge when that was all the rage?
I skimmed it. Yeah, I was not impressed.
It was a call to let men be men. Let men be men, manly men. And I always went, yes, but I'm not very manly, so what do I do? Yes, and for the non-very manly men, what
I was reading in that time period, where there was a whole bunch of stuff that came out for pastors about church growth and how to obviously grow your church and make it more effective, whatever. And
manly.
What the argument is that more women go to church than men. That's just a fact. It's pretty much probably always been that way. And the argument was, and this was all about the research done in megachurches, is what makes megachurches successful is that they target men. Oh. Because if you get a man to come to church, he's more likely to bring his whole family. Whereas there are a lot of women who go to church who aren't as successful at bringing their husbands or their children.
Right.
So the premise of the megachurch movement, this is in the 1990s when I started reading this stuff, was make a church that's appealing to manly men. Mm-hmm. And then you'll get the whole family. And this whole theology kind of grew out of it and on, and how churches that are too feminine are not appealing to men. And it became this broader argument for church growth, all predicated on gender roles, which was really weird, but really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I read the book Wild at Heart, and she points out that this was hot at about the same time as the Iraq War, where surveys showing that white evangelical Christians supported the war at much higher rates than other Americans, and also supported torture at much, much higher rates than other Americans.
That's because they go to church every Sunday.
Oh, you're funny, Skye. Then fast forward to 2016, and when she heard the Access Hollywood tape came out with Donald Trump bragging about being the manly man that he wants us to think he is, and white evangelical elites continue to defend him, that's when she decided she needed to write this book. And she first wrote an article called Donald Trump and Militant Evangelical Masculinity. Now, this is where it gets personal for me. Do you want to hear the part that gets personal for Phil?
I think I read this.
Besides the fact that I was called to be hypermasculine, and I most distinctly was not at any point in my life hypermasculine. She says, Dumez says, recently I was teaching a class in which I had students read the first 3 chapters of Genesis. Afterward, in the course of our discussion, one of my students raised her hand and said she just realized she had never read these chapters before. She thought she had, but now it occurred to her that her knowledge of their content had been primarily drawn from the VeggieTales videos.
Oh. I'm sure VeggieTales did a wonderful job teaching Genesis 1, 2, and 3.
We never, I'm almost positive we never taught Genesis 1, 2, and 3. So I think everyone in this story is wrong. One by one, other students raised their hands and said, me too. So one of her operative questions is, what has really formed the faith of most evangelicals? Is it the scriptures or formal theology, or is it something else? And by something else, she means me. Oh, man. What was going on culturally in the United States during the 1960s and 70s was a merger between militant masculinity and Christian nationalism that was taking hold at the heart of this new partisan evangelical identity, which included evangelicals supporting the Vietnam War, even when mainline Protestants were against the Vietnam War. So we were the ones who said, yes, we love this war, keep it going, we're behind it all the way. Because we love John Wayne and William Wallace and Teddy Roosevelt and soldiers and cowboys and all of that stuff. So all sorts, as she's doing her research, all sorts of evangelical men, especially those now in their 30s and 40s, will have run up against this in some way, whether they have embraced and tried to live it or rejected it or never felt entirely at home in a church because of it. I hate men's ministries. They all want to play golf together.
Yeah, we know how you feel about golf. Okay, well, can you pause for a second?
Yes.
I want to make sure I'm understanding her argument. Is what she's saying that white evangelicals have a theology of hypermasculinity, and because of that, they have latched onto the patriarchy in some elements of American culture? Or is it the other direction?
Right.
In other words, America historically has been a highly patriarchal society with white men at the top. And white evangelicals have been invested in the status quo and wanting to maintain the status quo, including patriarchy. And as a result of that, they have developed a theology of hypermasculinity because it reinforces the patriarchy of traditional America that they want to maintain. Does that make sense?
Yeah. You're expecting me to know which one she's arguing?
Yeah, because I would think it's probably the latter rather than the former.
Well, what would you say about the split over the Civil War that she has researched between mainline Protestants and evangelicals, where most Christians from an older tradition were saying, wow, we're really uncomfortable with this. And evangelicals were saying, yes, the military is God's sword on earth.
You're talking about the Civil War?
No, the Vietnam War.
Oh, I thought you said Civil War.
Did I? No, Vietnam. Yeah. Vietnam, not Civil War.
I think, again, it fits in with the God and country kind of idea that America is God's ordained, kind of the new Israel, the city on a hill. We are God's chosen people. And America's decided to go to war against Vietnam. And whatever the reasons, whether the detail, we are on America's side no matter what. We can do no wrong, and we're going to come up with a theology to justify it.
Okay. So do you think it was God and country that did it?
Yeah, I kind of think it's God and country more than just masculinity.
Yeah, but we like masculinity, and as you said, megachurches were all about the masculine.
Right.
So,
but the other side of it, though, is I think megachurches are predicated on entrepreneurialism. It's that that strong leader up front who's going to dynamically lead a group of people and build a big thing, and that's more associated with hypermasculinity.
Yeah.
So again, I don't think the foundation is a theology of masculinity. I think the foundation is American patriarchy, and out of that, we've developed a theology of masculinity.
Evangelical masculinity insists that men are driven by testosterone with voracious sex drives, which is what makes them dangerous and threatening and empowered for leadership. It's up to women. She was talking about you've heard it when pastors talk about their great sex, and they're going to do a series on on marriage, and they're smoking hot wives.
Mm-hmm.
How many evangelical pastors say their wives are hot? As a
Can I tell you a story about that?
Matter of pride. Go for it.
I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe, I was speaking at a very large youth convention, like, I don't know, 8,000 students, maybe more. And my family was with me. And I was a keynote speaker one night, but we were there for pretty much the whole week. And each night there was a different speaker. And the pattern was we'd go back to our hotel room that evening, and then we would kind of talk about the speaker for the night. And one night this guy gets up and starts introducing himself and his family. And he puts up this picture of his wife. And he's again speaking to a room of thousands of teenagers, and he says, for you young ladies out there, if you want to meet a really godly, amazing woman and a smoking hot wife, you need to meet my wife. So he says the smoking hot thing, and I knew right then. I was sitting. I don't know how old Zoe was. She was probably about 12. I don't know, something like that. And I thought to myself, I know I'm going to have to deconstruct this for her when we get, because he's talking to a group of thousands of teenage girls who are all inherently insecure. That's just what teenagers are. Right. And he puts up this, this Barbie looking picture of his wife and how she's smoking hot. I was like, So the whole night I'm thinking about, all right, I got to talk to Zoe about this and kind of deprogram her or whatever. And so we get back to the hotel room after the session, and I said to Zoe, hey, I really want to talk to you about the keynote speaker tonight and what he said. And she looked at me and she goes, Dad, I did not hear a word that guy said after the smoking hot wife comment. He just shut her. She completely shut him out because of that comment, because he found it, even as a young teenager, she was already sensitive to that and realized that guy lost all credibility with her because he only acknowledged his wife's beauty and did it in a really derogatory way. And so, I mean, it was just interesting and I was kind of proud of my daughter at that moment.
Child. She is so your child.
Yeah. Okay, what's her name again? Dumez. Dumez says, when she started reading up on evangelical sex advice, she was struck by how much of this domestic marital advice was directly connected to the nation state. It was so important for a wife to meet her husband's needs so that his confidence will be bolstered so that he can be an effective leader, not just of the family, but of the nation. That's odd. Have you bumped into that, Skye? I don't know. I haven't read very many evangelical books of sex advice, I have to say.
Yeah, I can't say I have, although it does have roots in earlier American history where they talked about concepts like Republican motherhood, which was a woman's role in society. Obviously, this is before women could vote. A woman's role was to raise virtuous sons who could then lead the republic, and to be sexually available and a servant to her husband so that he could then be an effective Republican man. Republican, like little r, Republican. Yeah. So that's a very old American idea.
Wow. Okay. On the military side, she says, because our politics were anti-communist and we had a commitment to an aggressive foreign policy, at the same moment, the Vietnam War, when other Americans were becoming more skeptical, it was a critical turning point. She says she was struck by how many books on Christian manhood were published after the Vietnam War that referred back to the Vietnam War, some that opened with Vietnam War stories about masculinity being proven on the battlefield. Then she says, this helps explain why by the invasion of Iraq in 2003, white evangelicals had effectively baptized the military, and the military was welcoming evangelical figures and ideas with open arms. So did we have a love affair? Do we have a little courtship between the military and evangelical Christianity?
Yeah, but at the same time as Vietnam, you also saw the rise of the modern feminist movement and the ERA and all these assertions of women's rights. So I wonder if the books that she's referring to weren't so much a product of Vietnam as they were a response to feminism, and they just happened to be drawing on the militarism of the era to bolster masculine identity.
Well, and I think it would go back to World War II, because that was really masculine back then. We had won. We had this, wonderful feeling about, our heroes from then, largely men. And So I think it's more complex than she makes it sound.
Well, I just wonder if us winning World War II, which was so obviously a morally noble cause, painted the United States and our military as a global agent of good.
It did. There's undeniably.
And then that's what made the 60s and Vietnam so challenging was, wait a minute. We are God's agent of good. So we had a really hard time not trying to argue that we're still the agent of good. We're still the agent of good. We're not doing anything bad. And then when, the hippies and the leftists and the communists started turning on the military and turning on America, we had to, we were even more wrapped with the flag of we have to stand up against communism and because remember World War II, we were God's, and then when Israel was formed out of World War II, it was like, we did that too, we're pretty sure. So now we get our eschatology into it. So we're bringing about the end times and Jesus is coming back because of the U.S. military winning World War II.
Well, and then you put in there the fact that the Republicans really believe in a strong military sort of as our salvation. And so it is the Republicans that give the most money to the military. So then the military leans to the Republican side oftentimes because of that.
Yeah.
So it's very complex stew, I think, that makes things the way they are.
And finally, she said, over the course of my research, I watched as one man after another who had made a name for himself by promoting this hyper-masculinity became implicated directly or indirectly in sexual abuse scandals. It was hard not to see connections between an ideology that embraced power and aggression and toughness and reserves all power for men with abuses of that power. Under this system, women and children are assigned subservient roles and told that subservience is obedience or godliness. There were so many heartbreaking stories where women felt they had no recourse and where faith communities covered for abusers because they thought they were protecting the church's witness. So, yeah, that's an issue.
Yeah, interestingly, though, in the last couple of years, it's become more complicated. There used to be the assumption that if you have a hyper-masculine, patriarchal theology, you're going to see women get abused in that system. And yet, since, in particular, the Willow Creek scandal, that's got turned upside down because Bill Hybels and Willow Creek were strong proponents of women in leadership, very egalitarian in their theology and doctrine, and yet you still had a leader abusing his authority and taking advantage of women under his guidance. So there was this false narrative that an egalitarian view of men and women in theology would lead to less abuse.
Okay.
And it hasn't. So I don't think I'm not an advocate of a patriarchal theology by any means, but simply fixing the theology doesn't solve the underlying problem.
Doesn't fix the men?
No, it doesn't. And there's a power issue at play here. I mean, you can have narcissistic, egocentric abusers of power in any theological system.
Yeah.
It's not limited to complementarian, hyper-masculine theology.
Right. But how many times have you heard someone argue that Jesus was a man's man?
Yeah, and you see it even in pop Christian art these days with this super buff Jesus who looks like he should be at God's gym.
Well, that's not exactly how he was portrayed in The Shack, if you read that.
Oh, yeah, no.
There was that.
And we didn't like that.
Which is part of the reason people are so upset.
That is the very first time, honestly, I'm going to be upfront with you, that I ever imagined male and female being created, like being part of God. Because I grew up in the South in a patriarchal society, exactly as you're describing. And so for me, I related to all the male aspects of God and Jesus and never comprehended that. I don't know, it's kind of weird. It was so by the time I read that, it felt very yucky to read that. But then I started thinking about that and realizing, gosh, if men and women are created in the image of God, then we both exist in who he is.
Yeah.
That was a new thought.
I do wonder what we do with hypermasculinity in a world where there is less need for conquest. There's less need for exploration. There's a certain point in human history where it becomes less about conquering and more about nurturing, because everything's been conquered for the most part. And that's where,
that's why we have professional sports.
Yeah, right. That's where you see men just watching the World Wrestling Federation because they don't know what to do, with that. So that is tricky. It's tricky. And it's really a moment, Skye, for people like you and I, and Jason, you too, join in on this lack of hypermasculinity parade where we're thoughtful and maybe even a tiny bit nurturing. And we don't like
I would
professional
not go that
sports.
far.
A tiny bit.
I've been around all three of you now for quite a while. Jason is the most nurturing, I have to give. Jason, you win that.
On. What happens in a world, in a post-conquest, a post-hyper-masculine world? What happens with all the hyper-masculine men?
There will always be conquest because there will always be business. There will always be sports. There will always be politics. There will always be these competitions where someone wins and someone loses. And so that's where it gets redirected.
Okay. Do we have a guest? Sure we do. I think we do. Skye. We have a guest. It's going to be great.
Remind people about Patreon.
Yes, thanks for your Patreon support. Go to patreon.com/holypost and you can support us. And we're starting to make merchandise, which will start showing up in the next few months. And you can get some really cool stuff if you're signed up. And you can follow us now on Instagram at Holy Post Podcast. Okay, and now we're going to go on with our guest. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
I remember being a kid in Sunday school, being told the story of the man who built his house on the rock and the man who built his house on the sand. You know how the story goes. It's based on a parable of Jesus from Matthew chapter 7. The man who built his house on the rock, when the storm came, his house stood firm. And the man who built his house on the sand, well, his house fell. The story was often used to differentiate Christians from non-Christians. Those who put their faith in Jesus, we were told, had built their house on the rock, and it will stand the storms of life. And the man who built his house on the sand? Well, he's the fool who doesn't put his faith in Jesus. That's how the parable has popularly been taught. Unfortunately, it's a complete misinterpretation of what Jesus meant. I know that might come as a surprise, but it shouldn't if you're a subscriber to With God Daily. Right now, we're going through a series on Jesus' parables and the profound things that he teaches through these stories about himself, about God, and about his kingdom. And a lot of these things are often misunderstood in popular consumeristic Christianity. If you want to get beyond the surface of things, if you want to look more deeply at Scripture and a deeper, more profound engagement with your faith, I encourage you to sign up for With God Daily. My daily devotional comes out 5 days a week via email, or you can get it on a mobile app. I also do an audio version, so if you prefer to listen rather than read, you can do that as well. Each devotional includes links to passages of Scripture and an historic prayer of the church to guide your own communion with God. With God Daily is available to anyone who makes a donation of any amount to support my ministry. You can sign up right now at withgoddaily.com or by downloading the With God Daily app to your iPhone or mobile device. With God Daily is the daily devotional for people who hate daily devotionals. One of the things I hear all the time from listeners of the Holy Post is how homeless they feel as a Christian today. They sometimes mean that theologically or even ecclesiastically. They can't find a church or a denomination that kind of accurately reflects what they view as the gospel or their faith in the world today. But a lot of you guys also say that politically, that you don't fit in the Republican Party as it currently is developed, and you don't feel at home in the Democratic Party either. Well, today's guest is somebody who I think you're going to resonate with a lot. And that's Justin Gibboney. He is an attorney and a political strategist who lives in Atlanta, Georgia. He's been active in the Democratic Party for a long time, even served as a delegate to numerous Democratic conventions. But a couple of years ago, he co-founded an organization called the AND Campaign. That's AND as an A-N-D. And it's a group that is trying to help people put their Christian faith forward as the primary way in which they engage in the public square and in politics, rather than putting partisanship or party identity at the forefront. Basically, the AND campaign recognizes that neither political party has a corner on biblical values or truth. And instead, we as Christians, rather than giving our loyalty to one of these parties, need to be loyal to Christ and then use our political engagement to push both of these parties to enact policies that are good for our neighbors and reflect the values of the kingdom of God. So I'm really excited to have Justin here with us. He has co-authored a new book with Michael Weir, who's been on the show before as well, and Chris Butler. It's called Compassion and Conviction: The AND Campaign's Guide to Faithful Civic Engagement. As you'll hear in the show and in our interview, I really believe in this book as probably the best thing you can read right now for helping you think Christianly about the moment we're in politically. So definitely consider buying this book. Again, it's called Compassion and Conviction. Here is my conversation with Justin Gibboney. Okay, Justin, welcome to the Holy Post. I'm so glad that you're able to join us.
Man, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, so before we jump into some of the book and the stuff you guys are up to in this election year with the AND campaign, I want to talk a little bit about your story and how you go from being an attorney and a Democratic political strategist and operative to launching the AND campaign. So I know there's a lot of detail in there that we don't have time to get into all of it, but can you kind of sketch out broad brushstrokes how you got from there to here?
Yeah, sure. So I was working at working at a law firm, doing political strategy on the side whenever I had a chance to do it. And I was doing it like, I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, so it's a very progressive space. And I just began to notice that everyone who I was running their campaigns or friends I had who wanted to run, even if they were Christian, it became pretty clear that there was almost an expectation that you would kind of surrender some of your convictions if you really wanted to get in the game. And that's just the way it was. And people just kind of accepted it. But when I looked around, I'm like, we're in Atlanta. We got a whole lot of biblical churches, a whole lot of Black traditional churches that are going to be more conservative culturally. Why in the world would, someone from my side of town have to run like they're a midtown progressive just to get in office when we have a critical mass of folks who are a little more culturally conservative? There should be a base there for that. And I just began to realize that it was because there just wasn't organization around that. So in this more progressive space, these secular progressive groups kind of controlled the reward and punishment mechanism when it came to politics. So they rewarded who they want to and, punished who they didn't want in there. And the church just hadn't responded to it. In the midst of that time, I was a delegate at 2 Democratic National Conventions, and it just reinforced how I felt about what was going on. And so eventually I said, enough is enough. I can't just participate and not be distinctive and not try to create something where Christians can be distinctive in politics. Because I also had friends who were Republicans who were like, man, I don't feel like I can be as compassionate as I need to be. This party just doesn't represent me. And so I end up meeting Sho Baraka, who's a hip hop artist. I end up meeting Angel Maldonado, who are he's a pastor. Those are the 2 other co-founders, and we create the AND campaign. And that's kind of the short of it. But really it was just a need to be faithful in politics, to say, man, I can't support people who I know they're going to get in office and feel like they have to go along with whatever the left says or whatever the right says. We got to find a way to do this better. And that's generally how I got into it.
And the meaning of the AND campaign, it's you're confronting the either or dynamic that seems to be in place. Explain that a little bit. I know you do a great job of it in the book, but help people understand why.
In our political landscape, there's this false dichotomy. And it tells people basically that once you enter politics, if you care about justice, you're going to go to the left. If you care about moral order, you're going to go to the right. And that we just didn't think that was right for Christians. We didn't think that was something that Christians could do, because when we looked in the gospel, especially if you look to Ephesians 4:15, it says that Christians are supposed to be able to speak the truth in love. And what that told us was that the gospel was love and truth, right? It was compassion and conviction. It was justice, which is, caring for your neighbor, but it was also moral order, to understand that we had a God of order. So caring for your neighbor isn't just about saying, do whatever you want to do. And I'll support you. And so that's what we're trying to address, that false dichotomy. And we did so by trying to help people understand that those things are connected, that love and truth aren't mutually exclusive. Social justice and moral order are not mutually exclusive. They're actually interdependent, and they work together. And if you look at the walk of Jesus, if you look throughout the Old Testament, you see love and truth, justice and moral order coming together, and that they're actually really skewed without one another. And so that's really what we're addressing. So and literally means love and truth, compassion and conviction, social justice and moral order, bringing those things together instead of the either or.
Okay, so in my exposure to various Christians around the country, it's pretty easy to lump them into two categories. One category would listen to what you just said and say, amen. Like, yes, I wish I had a political home that embraced both sides of this, love and truth. And then there are the other Christians, some are Republicans, some are Democrats, but they essentially say, no, you have, it's an idealized vision that you're presenting, and pragmatic says you have to pick the two options that are in front of you, either the team blue or team red. And yes, there's going to be compromise, but so be it. You got to take the lesser of two evils. What do you say to those Christians who say you can't, there isn't a third way? Just practically speaking, when you enter a voting booth, for example, there's no, party of the gospel there. It's one or the other.
Well, I would want to affirm part of that, which is to say that there is a practical benefit to being a part of a party. So the AND campaign is not coming at people say, don't do anything with parties, completely go against parties. No, I'm a Democrat. We have people in the organization who are Republicans. We understand there's a practical aspect to that. But what we're saying is that cannot become part of your identity. I think the idea that there is no center, that you have to choose one side or the other. If I'm a partisan, that's exactly what I'm going to want you to think. And so I think the people who think that are really indoctrinated, and they may need to step back to say, man, did I buy into something that I didn't know I bought into? But what we're saying is use the party as a tool, right? So use the party to get the work done that you have. Your agenda should be different than the party's agenda. That doesn't mean you can't be in the party. And so that's kind of what we're trying to get at and help people understand. The other thing that's wrong with that kind of shut up and join the party narrative is that it sees the election as everything, right? It ends and begins with elections. And we know that elections are very important, but there's a lot of stuff that goes on before the election. And so what you would try to do, if we're talking about our full framework, we don't just focus on the election. The election is the end of a process and the beginning of a process, right? So if you can get in on the beginning of that process and you can do it in an organized way, you're going to have an impact on who you're voting for, right? So it's not like we just all one day, they just show us the candidates appear and we have to vote on them. No, you can impact that. You can even have people who run if you're organized in how you do it. The other part of it is, even if you don't get the person that you want, you still have to hold people accountable, and you still have to be involved in that next part of the process, right? I think sometimes people say, well, I didn't get the person I want, so I'm going to give up. Or they say, I got the person I want, so I'm going to leave them to their own devices and let them do what they want to do because I'm just happy that we won. Totally the wrong attitude, right? Because people, and I wrote an article in Christianity Today about this, how I thought urban Christians let Obama down because we were just so excited that he got in. We did not hold him accountable, and he probably went way further left on a lot of issues than he would have if we had stepped up and said something. So I really think that if the candidate you want gets elected, you have even a greater responsibility to hold them accountable because you're responsible for putting them in there. But even if the person you want doesn't win, you got to push them because people change their opinions. They want to stay in office, so you never know what can happen.
So I heard a lot of that kind of rhetoric coming from white evangelical leaders leading up to and following the 2016 election, right? These are folks who were supportive of Trump. They reluctantly supportive, they said. The hold the nose, I'm going to vote for him anyway. And the argument you kept hearing was, it'll give us a seat at the table. It'll allow these Christian leaders to influence Donald Trump as a candidate and as a president. Whereas if we just write him off completely, we're not going to have a seat at the table. We're not going to influence him. But since 2016, it's felt an awful lot like all those leaders that were trying to justify their support of Trump haven't challenged him. Yeah. They've gone along with everything he said, which is kind of what you were saying some urban Christian leaders were doing with Barack Obama when he was president. They weren't challenging him. Is that because they're so still afraid of being shunned from the table, of not being in that inner circle of power, that they don't use a prophetic voice, regardless of party affiliation?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that go into it. I think it's power. With that comes influence. And sometimes it's just cowardice. Sometimes you just want to maintain the advantages and privileges that you have. And so if it goes against your personal interest to do so, then people just don't do it. I think people get a lot less spiritual when you're talking about things like influence and power. And they just end up not doing what they should have done. But you hit it on the head. It's about defending it, right? It's one thing to say, man, I voted and maybe that was a mistake, but I'm going to speak out and I'm going to make sure people know that I'm holding this person accountable. Completely different to defend or be quiet about what things that are wrong. And that's what's really unfortunate.
Okay, I want to dig into some of the stuff in this book. I don't think I've told anybody what the book is yet. It's called Compassion and Conviction, the AND Campaign's Guide to Faithful Civic Engagement. I can't think of a better book I've read in recent years that just succinctly outlines what Christian political engagement ought to look like. Loved it. It's fantastic. And at the end of every chapter, you give all these practical questions and group work to do together to kind of flesh this out and actually practice it, which is great. In the middle of the book, page 66, you guys talk about the Hidden Tribes of America study, which I think we talked about a long time ago on our podcast, but it's so interesting. So this study breaks Americans into 7 different tribes, from progressive activists on one end to devoted conservatives on the other. But let me read a quote because I want to get your reaction to this. The 2 smallest and most extreme tribes, the progressive activists and the devoted conservatives, are only 8% and 6% of Americans respectively. But they have the loudest voice in our socio-political discourse because of their high levels of engagement and large amounts of money. They often frame the issues for the majority of us, who the study calls the exhausted majority, 67%. The result has been high levels of participation. You go on to say, we run into trouble when we allow that entity to have undue influence on our values and opinions. So basically, you have this tiny fraction of Americans on both ends of the political spectrum who are polarizing all of us, even though most of us are somewhere in the middle. What do we do about that? I mean, it seems to be our media is driven by conflict. Politics is driven by demonization of the other side and the money that comes from these extremists. And the rest of us are all being caught up in it. How do we not get caught up in it? And what is the antidote to that extreme partisanship that a lot of Christians are finding themselves pulled into?
Yeah, I think the first thing you have to do is identify it, right? And so I think what we're trying to do in the book is say, hey, here's what's going on. Here are your puppet masters. Are you okay with these people deciding how you frame the issues? Because something else we talk about is how you frame an issue matters. Because if you frame an issue or question the wrong way, then you end up with 2 wrong answers instead of a right answer.
Give an example of how an issue that's framed badly.
Abortion. I mean, I think abortion is framed as either you're for women or, you're either for women or for children, right? And we're saying, no, you can actually be for both, right? I think you can be pro-life and care about what's happening to women and care about the fact that you have the maternal death rate in Mississippi is too high. You can care about those things. So if we buy into the frame that we get from secular progressives on that, then of course, I don't hate women. Why would I do that? Well, because it's framed wrong, right? And it puts you in a position where you have to choose between 2 wrong things. I think even the LGBTQ conversation is like that. It's like either affirm or hate. No, that's not how it works. Even in our personal relationships, we disagree with people all the time that we love and would take care of and would care for, right? That's what we mean by framing the issue, for yourself. And so when we point out these 2 different tribes, we're saying, number one, we need to identify this. We need to see what's going on. And then to answer your question, you got to get active. The exhausted majority has to find motivation to do the right thing. It's hard for me to explain as much how secular folks in that exhausted majority get excited and really start moving. It's not hard for me to explain how Christians should get excited and start moving. Christians should be outraged at injustice. We shouldn't have to be on the extremes to be very energetic about getting rid of injustice just based on what the Bible says about us. Christians should not be at home with any type of immorality that's being perpetuated around us. We should be energetic and excited about doing that, but we have to come together and we have to see it as an issue.
Okay, so one of the problems here, though, is you have this great line. I think it's repeated. I've seen it in more than one place, not just in this book. You said, the goal is not to have all Christians share the same exact politics, but to have all Christians think Christianly about politics. Mm-hmm. It's pretty hard to get Christians to think Christianly about politics when the media, as I said earlier, and these activists on the extremes are framing the issues. But it's also hard to get Christians to think Christianly about politics when in our own Christian communities, in our churches and parachurch organizations and in schools, we're not talking about politics. There's a huge segment of Christianity that just says, no, this is off limits. We're not going to go there, either because we don't think it's within the scope of our mission, or we believe it's within the scope of our mission, but we don't want to go there because it's going to be too divisive. Mm-hmm. So what do you say to those places, those Christian communities that are silent on this stuff and abandoning that to the media and these extremists to frame the issues?
Yeah, I think the Bible settles that issue for us. They don't really necessarily have to listen to me, but I think the Bible speaks very clearly about the expectation that we have to promote human flourishing and defend human dignity. And really, that's what entering politics is to me. Now, if someone were to say, well, we're entering just to be partisan and all that, well, maybe there isn't a good reason. But the reason that we're supposed to be in politics is because we love our neighbors. And politics presents us with a very robust opportunity to love our neighbors, right? If we look at the second half of the Great Commandment, love your neighbor like yourself. Well, that means that you have to do things for your neighbor that you would do for yourself in the civic arena. If there's somebody in your family that's being mistreated in their school, you would go up there and you would do something about it. If the kids in your neighborhood were drinking lead poisoned water, I can guarantee you wouldn't just sit there and allow them to die, right? Or to be harmed by what they were drinking. You would do something. And so what we're saying is, if you love yourself like you love your neighbor, you will do something for your neighbor too. And politics is a good tool for doing that. Not a master, but a tool for entering into that conversation. For those who think we shouldn't do it, I would suggest that you're just being a bad steward. Because when God puts something in your sphere of influence that you can change, you should try to change it. That doesn't take anything away from proclaiming the gospel. I think if one of your kids cut their leg and they were on the ground bleeding, although you pray and although you proclaim the gospel, God has put the means in your hands to do something about that. So you would disinfect it, you would put a Band-Aid on it, not because you don't think proclaiming the gospel matters, but because you can help that person. And in politics is the same thing. So if we start thinking about others the way we think about ourselves, then it starts to make sense that we should actually get involved in politics, and knowing that our work doesn't save us, but it's indicative of what's written on our hearts.
Okay, so I mean, I'm totally with you on. I've written and spoken on the importance of Christian involvement in politics, not partisan involvement, but political involvement for all the reasons you just said. Let's take it a step further, though, because you make a really good case that our involvement should not mean indoctrination into total conservative agenda or the total progressive agenda or team red, team blue. Having said that, though, is it possible for a Christian to faithfully, for example, run for office in one of these political parties without indoctrination? So, for example, let's say the kids in my neighborhood are being poisoned by lead in the water, and the best way to solve that is for me to run for a political office to make sure that this problem is solved. But doing so would mean having to throw my lot in with one party or the other, which would mean having to agree with that party's platform, neither of which conforms to my beliefs as a Christian. Like, at some point there has to be a compromise if I want to get the lead out of the water. So what do you do there? Can a faithful Christian run or be part of, not just vote for one of these parties, but actually be an active participant and carry the banner of Republican or Democrat today?
Absolutely. I think there's a way to go about it shrewdly. And you have to understand that there's some things you can't do. So when I talk to a candidate, they say, man, I want to run for office, I want to do something. I say, first of all, know exactly what you want to do, what you want to accomplish, and also know what you will never do, what you will never compromise. And so to answer your question, I think it can be tough. And the reason that it's tough is because Christians aren't thinking Christianly, right? If we actually were organized and we were actually together on a lot of these issues, it'd be a lot easier because we'd have a framework, we'd have an infrastructure to help people do that. As it is tough. And people have to really make some tough decisions about what am I willing to accept and what is completely unacceptable. And I'm not going to act like that's an easy decision. But as Christians start to not remove themselves from the party, but create some distance from themselves in the party and not feel, kind of feel like they need to fit in that partisan mold, then we can start thinking in a way that allows other Christians to run and have a base of Christians, because whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, I know that you're hitting on several issues that I care about. And now I'm willing to listen to you, where otherwise the party's going to say, man, don't even listen to that person because we're not approving them. But it's a process and we have to get organized.
Justin, in your time with the AND campaign, I don't want to put you on the spot too much, but are you hopeful? Are you seeing evidence that we're moving in that direction, or are we becoming more entrenched and homogenous in our politics? For example, there used to be a time where you could run as a Democrat and be pro-life. It seems like that's harder than it used to be. There used to be a time where you could run as a Republican and have a more compassionate view toward immigration or even an amnesty plan for those who are here undocumented. That doesn't seem likely anymore. So are we really opening up our parties to a more diverse set of beliefs that might conform more to Christian faith, or are we going the wrong direction?
The parties are absolutely going in the wrong direction. No doubt about that. You won't get any dispute from me on that. But what I would say is, and the reason that I see promise is that as God would have it, there is a critical mass of biblical Christians on both sides of the aisle. And as I go around the country and talk to folks and kind of let them know, kind of inform them on the framework, you do see people's kind of eyes open up and say, wow, there is a lot of potential here. Because if we weren't to think in such a partisan way, there are several different issues that we could join together on and really change the political landscape. I mean, it's hard to tell me that if a good number of the Christians on the Republican Party said we need to do something differently, the Republican Party is going to respond and start doing something differently. If the folks from the Black traditional church and the Hispanic Christians told the Democratic Party, no, we're not going for this or that anymore, then they're going to listen. And there's going to be candidates that are running that are going to listen to that because they want to be in office. But do we have the organization and the fortitude to take that stand? I think it's a process, but I see changes, and I think we can accomplish that.
So in 2016, as has been reported ad nauseum, 81% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. I think the stat is 89% of African Americans voted for Hillary Clinton. And when you have those kinds of margins with those groups, the Democrats, it seems to me, take a lot of African American votes for granted, just as Republicans take a lot of white evangelical votes for granted. The ability for either of those groups to say to their parties, hey, you can't take us for granted anymore, we're going to withhold our support unless you do X or Y, assumes that they're having their vision shaped more by their faith than by their political identity. Isn't that really the issue that we're talking about here, is making sure people put their Christian identity first and their political identity subservient to that? But all the evidence seems to point that it's the opposite than what's going on right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's because the parties have we've allowed the parties to misconstrue what our identity is. And so there are really people who tell you to be a Christian is to vote for Trump. That's ridiculous. And so, yeah, they're attaching it to their faith, but it really has nothing to do with their faith. And that's just shrewd political strategy by people who knew what they were doing. And that's why our political identity can never be in our party, right? We have to remove our political identity from our party, because when it's in our party, then we think that our identity is leading us to stuff that's very partisan, when it's actually the ideology. And we've conflated theology and ideology quite a bit. And one of the things that the book tries to do is really be clear in separating those things. So I think you're right in that people would think that it's their faith that's leading them to this situation. But a lot of times it's really just that ideology, and you've allowed your political affiliation to become religious in nature and become part of your identity.
Yeah, it's interesting to me, fascinating. Over the last number of years, we've seen more and more studies come out that talk about the declining importance of religion in more Americans' lives, the declining attendance of church, decline in religious identification. And it seems to be inversely proportional to the number of Americans that take their political identity more seriously. You know, the number of Americans who would be upset if their son or daughter married somebody of the other political party has risen dramatically since the 1960s. And so I wonder if a lot of Americans, frankly, are just using politics and partisan identity to function in their life the way religion used to. It used to give you a sense of community, of belonging, of mission, of purpose, of good and evil, of, you know, who's in, who's out. And now we've taken all those religious traits and put them onto politics, which is pretty dang frightening when you consider how many people have been killed in wars over religion over the centuries. And are we heading in that direction? Okay, I want to talk about an example you have in the book that I found pretty inspiring. You give a lot of time and attention to the importance of Christians educating themselves about issues so that they're not just being shaped by the sound bites that they hear in the media or from the extremes on the right or left. And the example you give was the Supreme Court ruling in Burwell versus Hobby Lobby in 2014. And you guys going into a meeting where the community was talking about this with a panel. Can you just tell that story? Explain what the ruling was and what happened when you guys went in and how it changed the conversation around that decision.
Yeah, so a few years, I guess several years back now, the Supreme Court weighed in on the Hobby Lobby decision, which was basically saying, could faith-based businesses restrict what type of birth control they get, you know, they paid for their employees. And so what happened was they were saying both birth control is fine, it's not a big deal, but there were some that were basically almost the equivalent of abortion, right? Because it was late term. They were like, well, as a religious business, we don't want to support those things. And the Supreme Court supported that. And so what happened was after that, maybe a day or two after that ruling came down, the Young Democrats of Atlanta had a panel. And so they invited some Planned Parenthood folks and some other, you know, progressives to talk about it. And of course, everybody was freaking out. This is the end of everything. Women are going to be dying in the streets and all that stuff. You know how that goes. And so I said, you know what? I had a group, and this was before the AND campaign. I had a group called Crucifix and Politics. And it was just folks I knew who were, you know, running their county party or whatever. And we would come together and have Bible studies and all that. And so we said, you know what, we need to clarify this. So what I did is I went through the case, kind of marked through the case, got some, you know, progressive scholars and others that I looked to, shared that with the group. And so we go to this event. And we let everybody say what they're going to say. Everybody's pulling their hair out. You know, the folks from Planned Parenthood, or they're giving their lines or whatever. And then we just start raising our hand and really breaking down what the case actually said, because it was clear that a lot of those folks up there hadn't even read the case. So we started breaking down what the case actually said. We even quoted some liberal and progressive scholars who said it wasn't the end of the world. And it was interesting because by the end of the night, people were asking us more questions than they were asking of the folks who were on the panel. So we weren't even on the panel. We were just there. But because we were actually giving them information, they're like, whoa. And it was interesting because I don't think people expect Christians to come in an informed manner like that. And so I think it's important that we do, but it was almost unexpected, right?
Well, being informed is another way of loving our neighbors, because the goal of the media is not to love their neighbors. It's to make money. It's to scare people. It's to get viewers. And the goal of a lot of politicians, sadly, is not to love their neighbors, but to get votes and to demonize the other side. It's we Christians and the church that ought to stand up and say, here's the truth. Here's the research. Here's what's really going on. And we want you to be informed with these facts so that you can better love your neighbor. And sometimes there are genuinely things to be upset about that we ought to be pulling our hair out over. But a lot of times these are tempests in a teapot, and they're stoked out of control in order to inflame viewers, voters, whatever. I would love to see more churches step up and play that role, to say, hey, we're going to have a forum tonight. We're going to talk about this tough issue right now, but we're going to make sure that the people who are teaching you about it are informed and aren't there just to inflame passions and anger and get votes. Talk about the current election. This kind of gets beyond what's in your book, but what are you seeing right now we have a little less than 100 days before the election in November. What are you seeing right now from Christians or from those who are not primarily partisan in their identity that makes you hopeful that we might see a different kind of engagement? And then obviously tell me what's worrying you.
Can I start with the former? I mean,
yeah, it's probably a little easier.
Yeah. I see a lot of fear and anxiety. And to your point, a lot of that comes from the media and, clickbait and all that stuff. But some of it is real. I mean, I think people have a good reason to fear another Trump administration, especially, people of color. And so there is some fear. There's some fear that it might not be a fair election. And so people are just worried about whether the democratic process is going to work and whether we're going to be able to move forward. The thing that I feel good about, though, is as we go and we speak to Christians, is that you're seeing Christians come together in general. And to say that we're not necessarily going to agree on a lot of different issues. But for instance, we just did the Churches Helping Churches challenge where we raised over $1 million from small churches. That came from traditional Black churches, but also white evangelical churches that said, look, we need to start working together. And the AND campaigns are also about to start something we're calling the Prayer and Action Justice Initiative, where we have really well-known faith organizations that would usually kind of be on both sides of the aisle coming together to say the church needs to step up about faith. So it's not a whole lot that's directly related to the election I'm excited about, but there are political issues that I think Christians, when it comes to criminal justice, police reform, that in my conversation with Christians, they understand the need to step up and do better. The election's tough. It's going to be tough. And we just need to make sure that we understand that it's never worth losing a brother or sister over, that we need to come together and we'll make it through whatever happens.
So for the people listening to this, how can they support, other than sending you money like any other nonprofit, how can they get involved or participate in what you guys are trying to do with the AND campaign?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one thing is just sharing content. We come up with a lot of content, whether it be on social media and otherwise. And I think sharing that with your friends and family and your church family is important. Sharing the book, reading the book, buying the book, it's really going to give you a framework for how to deal with the civic arena today. It works at different levels. And so whether you don't really understand politics or you're someone who's been doing it for a while but wants to do it better, it will work for you. As you mentioned, there are questions and activities with every chapter. And then again, we're about to launch this Prayer and Action Justice Initiative, which is going to, it's going to touch on some national policy, but a lot of local policy coming to cities and bringing churches together to change the criminal justice system, to change the interaction between police officers and the community. And there's going to be some really clear on-ramps to engage with that. And that's launching next Tuesday. So I think people will enjoy it.
And your website where they can get all this stuff is andcampaign. Sorry, go ahead.
Andcampaign.org, andcampaign.org.
Right. And you guys, you and Michael, who's been on our show, I think at least once or twice, have a podcast called Church Politics. So explain how that goes.
Yeah, the Church Politics Podcast, where me and Michael Ware, who is the chief strategist of the AND campaign, we talk about politics from a Christian worldview. And so we're trying to raise civic literacy and just help Christians apply their values to the issues of the day.
I listen to it from time to time. I can't recommend the book and the podcast enough, and you're probably too kind to say this, but I think if you read this book and you listen to your podcast, that's great. But what would really make it great is at the same time you turn off cable news. You have to kind of cut the toxin that's going into the system, not just bring good stuff in. So I don't know. It's hard for me. The more I engage in these conversations around politics, we had David French on a couple weeks ago. It seems like so much of the problem is just the media and social media too. Like a lot of the garbage that people are just tapping into and the unhelpful framing of the issues as you discuss. So thank you so much for serving us all and the church, especially with these resources and with your podcast, and grateful for your leadership in all this. Do you mind sticking around for a few minutes after we're done in order to record a bonus segment for our Patreon folks?
Let's do it.
Okay. Justin, thank you so much for being here. Grateful for your leadership, grateful for the book. If you guys haven't picked it up yet, it's called Compassion and Conviction, the AND Campaign's Guide to Faithful Civic Engagement. And look forward to talking to you more maybe as the election gets closer.
Let's do it. Thanks for having me, brother.
The Holy Post podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Skye Pilot Media, that's Skye's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.